Hey everyone, welcome to week 7. In part A, we will cover file input and output, reading and writing files with Python, and finally processing strings. Alright, so let's first talk about file input and output. So this is going to be covering when we can work with other files outside of our program. So potentially you want our code to interact with other files that are stored on our computer, whether that be maybe our program is getting information from these other files that we can then use in our code to process calculations or do stuff like that. Or maybe our code is going to produce new values and we want to put these data information into other files on our computer. So when a program needs to save data for later use, for example, a program might write this data to be stored in an extra file. The cool thing about this is then the data can then be read from the other file at a later time. So again, when I talk about file input and output, what I mean is allowing our Python code, our Python programs, which themselves are files, be able to communicate with other files stored elsewhere on our computer. So there's a lot of software that does use file input and output, meaning there's a lot of software that does interact with other files on the computer. So for example, any word processors, those interact with lots of other files on our computer, right? They can create new Word documents, they can open old Word documents, all that fun stuff. Image editors, spreadsheets as well. Games also use save data files to save information from your current status in the game. It might save information about your character, potentially their names, some traits, that sort of stuff. It might also save some data about your map, maybe where your character is on the map, where different things are located on your map, and so on. So before we start talking about how we can write code to actually process information with other files stored in our computer, I first want to go over a couple of key definitions. So first, let's define what writing data is. So writing data is going to be the process of saving data in a file. It's the process of taking data and then putting it into a different file. This different file that you're going to put it into, this is what we consider an output file. We call it an output file because our program, the Python program, is creating output that is being placed somewhere else. That somewhere else just happens to be in another file instead of, on the screen as output. So again, an output file is a file to which a program stores data. And then on the other end, we have reading data. So reading data is the process of receiving data that already exists from a different file. So this is our program reading information from somewhere else. So it's kind of like the input on the keyboard, except instead of getting input on the keyboard from whatever the user types in, the input is going to be received from a different file on the computer. So files from which data is read, those are called input files. Those are files from which a program gets information from, gets input file from. So again, writing data is the process of saving data to a file. Reading data is the process of receiving data from a file. We will talk about how to do both. Again, though, before we get too deep into how to write it in Python, I still have a couple more terms that I want to cover first. Now, as we think about how we're going to actually process information in Python that's from other files, or process information in Python and put it into other files, there's sort of 3 steps that we're always going to see in our Python file. First step, we're going to open the file. Second step, we'll process the file. Now, this second step is going to be the bulk of your code, and this will either be the step where you are writing data to other files or you're reading data from other files. And then the third step, which is very important but is sometimes forgotten, is to close the file. Now, it's very important to remember to do this every time, because otherwise your file might do some weird stuff, such as maybe it doesn't save everything. So again, you do need to make sure that whenever we work with a file input and output, not only do you open the file, but you also close it when you're done using it. And we'll talk about the specifics of what these 3 steps look like in Python code in a bit. Alright, some more terminology I do want to talk about first though. So first, there's 2 different types of files for the most part. Now these are files, again, these are any files that are saved on your computer. Most of them are of one of 2 types. One type is text files, second type is binary files. Now when we actually process information with other files in our Python code, for this class, the other files that we will be working with will all be text files. That said, it's still important to know the difference. So let's talk about these 2 different types of files. So a text file is a file that contains data that looks like text. It's using some sort of encoding scheme that is like ASCII, where you can actually understand what the text is. So the key sort of characteristic of a text file is that you can open it with a simple text editor. Now when I say simple text editor, I mean one of those that has no flashy buttons. So something really simple like Notepad or TextEdit or WordPad, one of those really simple programs. So examples of files that can be opened with a simple text editor, TXT files. You know, those are just basic text files. Python files actually are text files. You can open them with any basic text editor. .csv file, CSV stands for comma separated value. That is a way that you can store Excel spreadsheets, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. And again, for the purposes of when we write our code to work with other files, these other files that we're going to be working with in this class, they will be of this type. They will be text files. They're just a little bit easier to process, which is why we'll talk about them. That said, a lot of the things that we'll be doing with these text files, they'll be similar to things that you'll do with the other type of file, which is binary file. It'll just be slightly more complicated with binary files. So binary files, these are files that contain data that basically have not been converted to text. So if you've ever opened a file and it looked like just jumbled up nonsense, it had these weird symbols in it maybe, and who knows what it had in it, it's probably because it was a binary file. Now, binary files are intended only for a specific program to read it, which is why when you open them, if you open them with a program that isn't the specific program, it might look like nonsense. So again, if you've ever seen one of those, it's probably because it was a binary file that was not opened properly. So the key sort of characteristic of a binary file is that you can't view the contents with a simple text editor. So if you try to open a binary file with TextEdit or NumberPad or anything like that, it will look weird. It will just have all these weird symbols, and it won't make sense. So examples of binary files, any image files, those are going to be binary files because they're specific to, you're supposed to use some sort of image editing software to open them. .doc files, so Word document files, those are binary files because you're supposed to open them with Word. You can't open a Word doc in a simple text editor like NumPad, TextEdit, anything like that. So again, these are the 2 types of files. We have text files and we have binary files. Now again, for this class, we will be working with text files just because they're a little bit simpler, but you should still understand the key differences between these 2. Alright, so all these files that we have, there's also different ways that you can access the data in the files. Now when I say access the data, what I mean by this is either reading the contents, so like actually going in and being able to read what's in the file, Also, whenever you type stuff into the file, these are both ways to access file, either reading or writing to it. So there's two ways to read data stored in a file. There's sequential access and there's direct access. Now, we will be focusing on files which we use sequential access to access these files. But again, same sort of idea as the last couple slides we talked about. It's still good to know sort of the two different ways you can access data. And in the future, you can potentially write code that interacts with files that use direct access, but it requires a little bit extra thought. So again, we will mostly be working with sequential access. Actually, we will only be working with sequential access files, but it's still good to know the differences. So let's talk about them. Alright, so sequential access files, these are files from which you read data from the beginning to the end. You have to read the data in order. So you can't easily skip around the file. So these are going to be similar to how cassette tapes work. So you remember in the olden days when we listened to our music and we had to, let's say there was a song at track 5 that we really liked. We had to sit there and press, the fast forward button. We had to hear the tapes wind up and we had to wait for it to go through, albeit a little bit faster, but we had to wait for it to go through the other tracks before we could get to track 5. When we got to the end of it, we had to rewind the tape, right? If you were polite and weren't rude to the next person, listening to the tape in the car or whatever. So cassette tapes are like sequential access files. You have to read through everything in order. Again, this is what we are going to focus on. So when we work with other files, those files will be files with sequential access. The alternative is direct access. So files that have direct access, these are files that you can jump around in. So this is going to be similar to how CDs or MP3 players work. So for example, like on a CD, if you wanted to listen to the song at track 5, you could just skip to track 5 and it would jump there and you wouldn't have to wait for, this weird tape winding fast forward nonsense. So same sort of idea with the direct access files. You can jump around in them easily. Alright, a couple more things I do want to cover before we dive into the coding part. So let's talk a little bit about file names. Now I know this might sound a little bit silly to clarify, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So files are generally identified by their file name. So these are the same file names that when you save a file, the name that you save it as, that's the file name. Most files also have a file extension. So a file extension is basically the second part of the file name, right? It's the dot whatever part of the file name. So in this class, for example, you've been saving files, Python files that have the .py extension. There's lots of other file extensions. I've already mentioned a few when I was talking about the different types of files, but one file that I do want to point out again, .csv files, comma separated value files. So these are files which are kind of like Excel files, except all the data is separated by commas instead of, in that table sort of setup. Alright, one more thing to cover before we jump into the code is this thing called file objects. So whenever you are working in Python and you want your Python code to be able to interact with another file, the first step that you do is you make a file object. Now this file object is something that exists in your Python code, and it's sort of this messenger between your Python code and the actual file itself on the computer. So this file object is something in your Python code that essentially represents the other file. This file object is going to be stored in memory and again provides a way for your program, your Python program, your code to talk to the other file. And we'll talk in a little bit about what it looks like to make a file object and then everything else that comes with processing information with other files.